Do you guys recall the Callisto Protocol? You know, that Dead Space spiritual successor that came out back in December that was more or less forgotten after about 2 weeks? Last week, the game made its way back into the news cycle. Specifically, an article came out discussing how the game severely underperformed, not only for the developer Striking Distance Studios, but for their parent company Krafton. The Korean-based company has essentially labeled the game a financial failure, selling only 2 million copies of the expected 5 and costing them almost $162 million US over the 3 years it took to develop. So, given all that, and paired with the upcoming release of Motive Studios' Dead Space remake, I figured now would be a good time to revisit the Callisto Protocol and what propelled this game from a much anticipated spiritual successor to its current status. The Dead Space franchise has long been considered one of the greatest horror survival games in gaming history. At the time of the first entry's release back in 2008, the game was revolutionary for its over-the-top gore, stylish combat, an interesting blend of sci-fi and horror. Despite it being another zombie shooter entry, at the time it was seen as incredibly unique, and no game before had attempted the space zombie mashup in such a fashion. The game spawned a sequel, which in my opinion improved on everything the first did very well, and then took a slight turn in the third release in 2013. Dead Space 3, while being typically successful, attempted to mold the series to a more generic shooter which didn't sit well with fans of the franchise or critics. As a result, it was deemed financially unsuccessful by the publisher Electronic Arts, and no further entries were published in the Dead Space series. The developer, Visceral Games, made their name in gaming through this series specifically. Prior to Dead Space, the company had been best known for their work developing PGA Tour titles and movie tag-along releases. Their last notable release was Battlefield Hardline in 2015, a game that wasn't well received by most gamers and quite frankly can be dubbed as the first of many steps that led to the fall of the Battlefield franchise in my opinion. Alas, in 2017, Visceral Games was dissolved and absorbed into EA. Glenn Schofield is perhaps the most notable figure amongst all of this, serving as the VP and General Manager at Visceral Games, as well as being the mastermind behind Dead Space. Schofield had left Visceral Games back in 2009 after Activision hired him to help lead Sledgehammer Games, one of several studios that produces those Call of Duty games. This departure is also a big reason as to why Dead Space 3 is so different from the previous 2 entries. 10 years later, Schofield announced that he was forming Striking Distance Studios under Krafton, a Korean-based developer that formed in 2018 under their parent company Bluehole. Krafton's most notable release to date had been PUBG Battlegrounds, a shooter that gained steam just as fast as it fell off with gamers around the world. The trio shooter has more or less maintained an international player base regardless, and it's that interest that pushed Bluehole to implore Krafton to expand its universe. With Glenn Schofield in their ranks, it seemed like a good opportunity for the PUBG universe to expand outside its military-based settings. While Schofield had already had the idea for Callisto floating in his head, the attempt to meld it into the PUBG universe wasn't happening, and by May 2022 it had been officially announced via Twitter that the game would be a standalone. Alongside him on the development team were 20 to 30 former members of Visceral Games, Sledgehammer Games, and EA that had all worked with Schofield directly in the past. With such a horror mastermind and notable team behind him, the Callisto Protocol had rightfully gained quite a bit of hype from many gamers, myself included. While there had been other games that had attempted sci-fi horror, some of which were executed pretty well, none of them ever lived up to that original fear and awe the Dead Space franchise exuded. Development news on the game had been fairly mum, with some outlets even speculating that the game was possibly delayed due to a lack of updates and even teaser footage. Then in October 2022, following some drama that Schofield was promoting crunch culture, he assured eager gamers that the Callisto Protocol would not be delayed and was still expected to release on December 2nd, 2022. Unlike many other AAA releases last year, the Callisto Protocol had no early reviews. Unfortunately for these same releases, this often doesn't mean anything good, especially when many developers and publishers have come out to openly state how much a negative early review damages their revenues. In fact, this has become such an ongoing thing that pretty much every major publisher has been caught paying off reviewers. This served as the biggest red flag, as upon release, the Callisto Protocol was met with a lot of negative commentary. The game was incredibly buggy on release day across all platforms, particularly more so on PC, where the stuttering and freezing got so bad bad that within 48 hours, the game had an amazingly low 22% approval rating on Steam. Schofield and a handful of others came to Twitter to ensure that it was a clerical issue, that the wrong patch had been deployed on launch day and hence all the issues. However, this wasn't enough, as the messy launch also caused an 8% dip in Krafton stock that same day. My general rule of thumb is to try and avoid any sort of review before a game releases. I do the same with movies, viewing the first trailer for each and stopping there, as, well, let's face it, the amount of trailers we get for a single piece of entertainment basically spoils a movie more than anything else these days. Now, given this can be hard, I would rather form my own opinion on something rather than let a negative or positive review unintentionally shape how I view the game as I play it. This is the same mindset I kept in mind with the Callisto Protocol. The Callisto Protocol places players in the shoes of Jacob Lee, a freelance cargo ship operator whose Voyager unfortunately crashes on Callisto, one of Jupiter's moons and home to Black Iron Prison. Upon being found at the crash site, Lee is admitted as a prisoner, and after a rather brutal intake, he awakens to find the prison has been overrun with the ghoulish undead. With the help of a fellow prisoner, Elias, it's your mission to basically stay alive long enough to escape this now undead moon. The entire point of the Callisto Protocol, I feel, is to immerse yourself in a terrifying prison landscape and make you feel as though you yourself are trying to escape a now desolate planet. As a result, this game serves as more of a cultivation of atmospheric survival horror, unlike combat-based survival horror as its inspiration had done. Approaching the game with this frame of mind makes for a pretty neat survival horror game, even if it does feel somewhat unoriginal. However, this delve into dark space horror isn't enough to help the Callisto Protocol stand on its own two legs. The game borrows basically everything you can think of from the Dead Space franchise. The over-the-shoulder camera angles, final blow animations, D-pad functionalities to access your inventory. Heck, you even need to continue holding a bumper down just to run. The health bars, which used to be on the spines in Dead Space, is now instead on the back of prisoners' necks. This obvious mimicry therefore fails to make the Callisto Protocol its own game, instead riding on the coattails of the franchise that made Schofield a powerhouse name in survival horror gaming. With Schofield having the idea for this for so long, to me it seems like this game was originally supposed to be either a mainline entry or spin-off for Dead Space. All that aside, the Callisto Protocol's plot is just all over the place, and the awkward pacing offers it no favors. What plot development is introduced is spliced with overly long segments of sneaking, crawling, and traversing over obstacles left in the wake of the prison's collapse. When Jacob does have a moment to interact with minor characters, there isn't anything to hook players in. Comparatively, when you played as Isaac Clarke, the protagonist in Dead Space, despite his development being weaker in the first entry, he had enough of a haunted backstory paired with his discovery of the artifact to keep you wanting more. The motivations of the supporting characters are equally lackluster, and every mission is laid out as the most basic, get to this area and do this type. As previously mentioned, the excess of mild cardio you endure as Jacob really offsets the mood the creative team was going for here. Atmosphere aside, the inconsistent enemy sequences leave you a bit confused as to what Striking Distance Studios was trying to achieve with this game. Poorly timed surprise music paired with predictable jump scares and the weird on and off influxes of enemies had me genuinely wondering if the development team had a clear vision of what Callisto was supposed to be. By the time I was 2 hours into it, I felt bored and a little exhausted by the game's structural inconsistencies. In addition, I didn't feel particularly chilled by Black Iron Prison or its demise, as yet again I found myself in areas that I had seen before in Dead Space. The combat is clunky and unpolished. At launch, I wasn't sure if this was just a new release thing or just another unfortunate, let's get this out as soon as possible so we can bring home the money. But I found myself really frustrated with the combat mechanics. Over a month later, I still get this feeling when I revisit the game. Despite the controls being more or less identical to Dead Space, it seems like the developers were reaching for more realism in the way the combat plays out on screen. You can easily notice this when with each fight interaction, the camera angles adapt to landing blows and final kills. The end effect is an onslaught of combat that doesn't match what you press, nor registers when you execute them as the tutorials had instructed. For example, I would go to block an oncoming swing by tilting down on the left joystick, and my character would get tossed aside. I assumed I was executing it wrong, so I played with the timing, changing when I would initiate the block. The outcome was still the same 9 times out of 10. It also led me, on more than one occasion, to being absurdly confused in what and where I was fighting when I encountered more than 3 enemies at once. Visuals are not a staple that help me determine what a good game is. In fact, it is the absolute last thing I take into consideration when encountering a game and even when developing the review for it. That being said, I can acknowledge where credit is due, as the Callisto Protocol is a next-gen stunner. Sony had also lent 150 motion capture artists to the project, and the panache they have for that kind of thing certainly shines through in Callisto. What is really sad is that where the Callisto Protocol had a chance to become its own game and build upon what Dead Space did, they chose to copy it and fluff it up with amazing visuals. The somewhat cool attack and blow animations, along with the strong graphics, end up acting as a herring for how uninspired and empty this game really is. In the end, it actually stands out as a culmination of what the industry has become, a club of money-hungry publishers that are confident in putting out something of quality rather than substance. The Callisto Protocol is therefore not revolutionary in this sense, but instead represents the final straw on the camel's back. To drive my point home, there are a handful of game franchises that come to mind that have done exactly this. Gears of War and Halo are AAA titles that immediately come to mind. The original trilogy of Gears games are fantastic sci-fi military shooters. The action is packed, the characters, even the secondary ones, have complete and moving arcs, and the story is one you can easily get absorbed into. However, following Microsoft's acquisition of the franchise from the original developers, Epic Games, in January 2014, a new developer called the Coalition was formed under Microsoft Studios to essentially manage the franchise. This was absolutely disastrous, in my opinion. Gears of War 4 and its sequel 5 both take place 20-ish years after 3 and incorporate new characters that you honestly can't give two knacks about, even when they try. Both games were visually stunning, but were desperately lacking the charm and character that original trilogy had. Not unlike Gears of War, the Halo franchise underwent a very similar transformation, with 343 Industries being formed in 2007 after the departure of Bungie. Bonnie Ross, until recently, headed the studio, and under her, Halo became a shell of its former self. Master Chief lost the masculine edge that carried him through the original trilogy and made him so iconic, serving as the ultimate badass we all wish we could be. While 4 wasn't altogether terrible, it was the beginning of a path that, in my honest opinion, destroyed the franchise. Halo 5 was a mess, mismarketed as a game that it never was, introducing characters that, for those of us that don't follow the extended lore, left us wondering, who the hell are these things and why haven't we seen them earlier? Much like Gears of War, Halo 4, 5, and now Infinite were games that looked stunning but offered no actual substance, and players recognized it with the abysmal player counts for the latest entry, Halo Infinite, laughably low, and the behind-the-scenes chaos at 343 Industries reflecting the lack of tact and care being given to this franchise. Much like those two, the Callisto Protocol knew it could capitalize off its former player base from Dead Space. It was confident in releasing a subpar project because they knew that there would be people that would buy it regardless due to Glenn Schofield and company's involvement. Another recent release I can recall doing the exact same thing is Cyberpunk 2077, in which CD Projekt Red rode through the coattails of its success with The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, confident that its broken product would sell regardless for that alone. Only in recent months has Cyberpunk really bounced back, thanks to the release of the companion anime series and an increased publicity around its upcoming DLC content. Star Wars Battlefront 2 did something akin to CD Projekt, capitalizing off the existing Star Wars fanbase in order to sell a pay-to-play game that, despite being negatively received, still made insane revenue off the microtransactions of that same hardcore fanbase. We are experiencing an industry that has become dominated by publishers that had its golden era years ago and used their brand power to stay at the top. There are many gamers, myself included, that still get baited by this fond nostalgia. They've gotten comfortable releasing uninspired cash grabs because there will always be enough of an audience ready to buy it. This pattern is further exacerbated by the influx of young gamers, who will never actually know any better and will continue to feed this cycle now that gaming has become such a popular pastime. The Callisto Protocol in the end serves as the pinnacle of all these factors and a benchmark for the standard of modern gaming. Rather than the big names choosing to innovate, they've become profit-driven and lost the creativity that made this industry attractive in the first place. To add another nail in the coffin, the game will be having paid DLC content that, alongside some cosmetics and new death animations, will likely be just as lackluster with its additional story content. So, with that all said, despite being visually enamoring and excelling at its eerie environment, environments, the obvious mimicry to Dead Space fails to make the Callisto Protocol a unique entry to the space horror subgenre. Striking Distance Studios missed the mark in attempting to stand above its inspirations, instead choosing to ride the coattails of it and using that to hook in prospective gamers that hold that original franchise dear. This is a release that, if you are interested in it, you can certainly wait for a decent price drop before purchasing. And here's hoping that the upcoming Dead Space remake will be a far more satisfactory sci-fi horror experience. What did you think of the Callisto Protocol? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this commentary and would like to see more of it, a much appreciated clicking of those like and subscribe buttons, dear viewer. Want a concise, informative weekly recap of the biggest gaming news? You can catch me over on Rumble every Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern for my This Week in Gaming podcast on The Lambency Show. You can also find episode re-uploads and more of my game reviews over on thelambencyshow.com. And if you have a movie and just need a really good take on it, you can join me for Mischief Mayhem Movie every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern on YouTube over at Cannoli Sasquatch Productions. Thank you for tuning in and stay frosty, friends.